Have you ever had one of those days, where the world just feels like it's shifting, like right beneath your feet?
Oh, definitely. You look at the headlines for just one day and yeah, challenge after challenge.
Exactly. Or some new tech, or just a completely jaw-dropping event.
It happens.
Well, that's pretty much why we're doing this deep dive today. Our mission, basically, is to give you a shortcut,
Hmm.
a way to understand some of the really big global and U.S. news stories that broke on July 8th, 2025.
Right.
We've sifted through a whole stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes, and we've tried to pull out the key insights.
The important stuff.
Yeah, the nuggets. The goal is really to help you connect the dots so you feel, actually well-informed, not just swamped by it all.
And July 8th was definitely one of those days that just shows the sheer breadth of what's happening.
For sure.
You had major economic shifts, pressing climate crises, these really complex geopolitical tensions.
And social policy changes, too. Big ones.
Right. It was a real snapshot of a world in motion. And, a lot of these stories that seem separate, they're actually deeply connected.
They really are, you're right. So let's try and unpack it. Maybe start with the global economic currents.
Sounds good.
We're calling this bit the tariff tempest because on July 8th, President Trump really ramped up the international trade tensions.
He did, threatening pretty high tariffs.
Yeah, if renegotiations with the EU and certain Asian nations in Japan, South Korea specifically, weren't done by early August.
And we're talking potentially 50% on copper and other metals.
A 50% levy.
Yeah.
What's the immediate fallout from a threat like that?
Well, the immediate thing is, like you said, the shockwave. The EU fired back pretty quick.
Okay.
They said the proposed baseline tariffs, 10% on U.S. goods, just weren't enough for them.
Right.
But the bigger picture here, it wasn't just about the usual trade partners. Trump also went after the BRICS nations.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the newer members, right? Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia.
Exactly. An additional 10% tariff threat for them. And this came just as they were seriously talking about alternatives to the U.S. dollar for trade.
Ooh, timing.
Yeah. And Brazil's President Lula da Silva, he publicly pushed back hard, said, we are no subjects of an emperor.
Wow. That's a statement.
It is. It speaks volumes about, potentially shifting global economic balance.
And the markets definitely felt that, didn't they? Copper futures jumped. What was it?
An incredible 13%. Hit a record $5.69 a pound.
Which is like $12,330 per metric ton?
Roughly, yeah. Huge spike. And you saw U.S. stock futures kind of drift. Bonds went up as investors looked for safety.
Dow futures dropped.
Yeah.
But currencies in copper exporting countries gained.
That's right, because copper is just so critical.
Why copper specifically? I mean, beyond just being a commodity.
Well, it's essential, isn't it, for infrastructure construction and crucially for all the clean energy tech.
Like EVs, solar panels, wind turbines.
Exactly. So a 50% tariff, that could seriously drive up costs for manufacturers, for builders. It fuels inflation.
And potentially fragment supply chains.
For sure. U.S. business groups, they were quite vocal about it, calling for, measured reforms.
Sector-specific stuff.
Yeah, and pushing hard for exemptions, especially for those clean energy projects.
Makes sense. They're arguing it's not just trade, it's about future industry.
Precisely.
Okay, so from trade wars to, shopping wars. July 8th also kicked off Amazon's biggest Prime Day ever, 4 days long.
Right. And predictably, Walmart and Target jumped in.
With their own overlapping sales.
Yeah.
Walmart deals, Target Circle Week. It was a full-on retail fight.
Absolutely. And you have to see this against the backdrop we just talked about, the tariff uncertainty, the wider economic jitters.
So analysts are watching consumers really closely.
Very closely. I mean, despite inflation worries, Amazon alone was projected to pull in over $23.8 billion.
Wow.
So how people actually spend during these sales, given everything else, that's a huge indicator for the holiday season forecasts.
Maybe long-term e-commerce strategy, too.
Exactly. It's like a real-time check on consumer confidence.
Good point. Okay, let's shift gears now. Something equally impactful, but honestly much more devastating. Climate.
Yeah.
We saw extreme weather just everywhere. Let's start in Central Texas. That catastrophe.
The floods. Awful.
From July 4th to 7th, remnants of Tropical Storm Barry just unleashed these catastrophic flash floods. By the 8th, the death toll was over 100.
I saw 118 confirmed and still 180 missing, including kids from summer camps like Camp Mystic. Just heartbreaking.
Making it the deadliest U.S. inland flood since 1921.
That's what the report said. The scale was just unprecedented. The Guadalupe River crested at 46.3 feet.
Which is massive, way over flood stage.
Totally overwhelmed the infrastructure, led to huge destruction, and rightly so. It's triggered intense scrutiny, hasn't it?
On emergency alerts, infrastructure readiness.
Climate resilience, yeah. How do we manage this? Because experts are warning this kind of extreme rainfall is getting more frequent.
And people were frustrated with the slow emergency response times, too.
Understandably. It brings the whole climate adaptation question front and center.
And it wasn't just Texas, right? Europe was baking.
Oh, yeah. Greece actually had to close the Acropolis for hours on the 8th. Temperatures over 41 Celsius.
That's over 105 Fahrenheit.
Right. They even banned outdoor work midday in some areas. Italy, Spain, France, Eastern Europe, similar story. Precautions everywhere.
And the heat brings the wildfire risk way up.
Hugely. Fires got close to Marseille, forced the airport to close. Meteorologists were warning strong winds were fanning the flames.
And this isn't just a one-off heat wave, is it? It connects to the bigger trend.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
2024 was already shaping up as a record warm year globally. Experts are talking about that 1.5 degrees Celsius average rise above pre-industrial levels being breached more consistently.
Which leads to calls for better urban cooling strategies.
Urgently needed, yeah. Especially in cities.
Back in the U.S., other areas were feeling it too. Southern California.
Severe heat wave there. Forecasts up to 115, even 120 Fahrenheit in places like Coachella Valley.
That puts immense strain on power grids.
Definitely. Raised wildfire risks again, prompted health warnings, opening cooling centers, even talk of potential rolling blackouts.
So then on the East Coast, different problem. Tropical storm Chantal's remnants.
Dumped incredible amounts of rain, over 10 inches in parts of central North Carolina.
Causing flash floods there too.
Yeah, tragically claimed 5 lives, 1 person missing, roads just submerged.
And that brings up debates about floodplain maps being outdated, urban sprawl.
Exactly. It highlights this urgent need to reassess development in high-risk areas. Policy adjustments seem unavoidable.
It all points to this massive issue of infrastructure vulnerability, doesn't it? Globally, too.
For sure. And that same day, July 8th, the friendship bridge between Tibet and Nepal.
Swept away by flooding on the Butakoshi River.
Killed 9 people, 19 missing. Just a stark, tragic reminder of how vulnerable crucial infrastructure is to these climate-driven floods.
Such a heavy toll. Okay, let's turn now to geopolitical flashpoints. Conflicts, alliances, humanitarian crises.
A lot happening there, too.
Starting with the Gaza crisis and this really contentious displacement debate.
Yeah, the ceasefire talks in Doha on the 8th, still moving incredibly slowly. Violence persisted.
And the humanitarian situation just sounds dire. Red Cross saying hospitals overwhelmed.
Over 2,200 weapon wounded, around 200 deaths reported around then. Even aid distributions were turning deadly.
And the toll on education. Over 18,000 students and educators killed. And journalists, too.
Over 160 journalists. Just devastating numbers.
But the really controversial thing that emerged around July 8th was this plan.
The relocation plan, yeah. Reportedly discussed between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump.
To move Gaza's population to a humanitarian city in Rafah or the Negev Desert.
That was the report. And legal experts, human rights groups, they immediately condemned it.
Calling it potentially criminal, violation of international law.
Exactly, warning it could be a humanitarian disaster on an immense scale.
Yeah.
What was the reaction globally?
Swift and largely negative, it seems.
Well.
Protests at the White House, the UN Security Council signaling it would denounce the plan. But at the same time, Israel was hinting a truce might be just days away. A real disconnect there.
A stark contrast. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, more escalation.
Russia launched a big drone barrage on the 8th, right? Targeting military recruitment centers.
Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Odessa. At least 1 death, dozens injured. Part of this wider Russian drone campaign.
But Ukrainian air defenses intercepted a huge number.
A record, they said. 728 drones in 24 hours. Speaks volumes about the intensity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. But then a countermove from the U.S.
Right. The Pentagon announced they were resuming Patriot missile deliveries to Ukraine.
Reversing an earlier pause.
Yeah, citing better production rates. Saying U.S. defenses were secure. Kyiv obviously welcomed it.
And Moscow condemned it. The usual dynamic.
Predictable, yeah. Underscores that ongoing strategic push and pull.
Elsewhere, the Red Sea saw trouble again. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Houthis expired.
On July 7th, and attacks resumed almost immediately.
And on the 8th, a deadly one.
Yeah, a Liberian-flagged cargo ship was hit. Tragically killed 3 mariners, injured 2 more.
So risks to shipping spike again, insurance premiums go up.
All of that. And renewed calls for talks to try and secure that vital shipping lane.
Okay, shifting to diplomacy. French President Macron started a state visit to Britain on the 8th.
That was significant. First French presidential visit since 2008.
Marked by big speeches, lots of ceremony,
Yeah.
carriage procession, Windsor Castle banquet.
Right. But beyond the pomp, what was the substance?
Macron really emphasized Europe needing strategic autonomy from the U.S. and China.
Interesting. While also pushing for more UK cooperation post-Brexit.
Seems so. Reaffirmed support for Ukraine, called for a Gaza ceasefire. And as a sort of cultural gesture.
The Bayeux Tapestry loan in 2026.
Yeah. It feels like an attempt to redefine those old alliances for today's world.
Makes sense.
And we can't skip over global human rights, big protests in Kenya.
The Saba protests,
Yeah.
July 7th and 8th, marked the 35th anniversary of the 1990 uprising.
Large-scale pro-democracy demos, but met with violence.
Sadly, yes. Reports of police violently suppressing crowds. Between 11 and 31 deaths, over 500 arrests.
And protesters demanding President Ruto resign over corruption, police brutality.
It really highlights that ongoing fight for accountability in many places.
And separately, a big move from the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, the ICC issued arrest warrants on July 8th for Taliban leaders.
For what charges?
Crimes against women, specifically citing their systematic exclusion from education, from public life, a landmark step, really, targeting gender-based persecution at that level.
Definitely significant. Okay, let's bring it back home. Domestic debates in the U.S., immigration, healthcare, government reform. Quite a mix.
Always is.
On immigration, the Trump administration really stepped up enforcement. Several big moves.
Like terminating temporary protected status, TPS.
Exactly. For about 76,000 Hondurans and Nicaraguans, many who've been legal residents since Hurricane Mitch back in '99.
So now around 50,000 face deportation by September.
That's the implication. The National TPS Alliance is suing, of course. Democrats were sharply critical.
And wasn't there a big confrontation in L.A.?
Yeah, really dramatic. July 8th, MacArthur Park. Heavily armed federal immigration agents conducting raids.
Sparking a showdown with Mayor Karen Bass and activists.
Right on the scene. Mayor Bass called the federal troop presence outrageous and un-American.
Strong words.
Warning it violates city autonomy, makes racial tensions worse. A very visible symbol of this tougher federal stance.
And there was major funding approved, too.
Huge funding. The Senate approved $170 billion for immigration enforcement.
Wow, $170 billion.
New detention centers, big expansion of ICE operations, passed with VP J.D. Vance breaking the tie, shows a clear legislative push for that enforcement-first approach.
Okay, what about healthcare?
A federal judge stepped in on July 8th, issued a temporary injunction.
Blocking the administration's attempt to cut Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood.
Exactly. It was part of that bigger bill they called the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Right.
Without that injunction, the estimate was up to 200 clinics could close, affecting millions of Medicaid patients.
Shows how fragile that access is when policies shift.
Definitely. And then government overhaul. The Supreme Court made a big decision on the 8th.
Clearing the way for those federal worker layoffs.
Yeah, allowing the Trump administration to move forward with downsizing plans, even while legal challenges are ongoing.
Significant for the civil service. Who dissented?
Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was the sole dissent. Highlights the major implications for federal workers, maybe even government stability.
And out in California, the homelessness debate continues.
It does. Cities like San Diego, Fresno enacting new sweeps of encampments.
Requiring people to relocate every 72 hours, with fines, criminal penalties.
Yeah, and predictably, drawing fire from homeless advocates.
Saying it just criminalizes poverty.
Right, and public health experts warning it disrupts care for people with chronic conditions. It's that constant tension, isn't it?
Between calls for affordable housing, more support, and calls for tougher enforcement, public order.
Exactly. Okay, last big section. Science, innovation, and society. This is where things get, well, kind of wild sometimes.
From de-extinction to daily life changes.
Let's start with de-extinction. This is pretty amazing. July 8th, a big announcement.
Colossal Biosciences and Ngai Tahu, the indigenous group in New Zealand.
Launching an initiative to resurrect the South Island giant moa, which vanished, 600 years ago?
Incredible. But it's not just science, right? There are huge ethical, cultural aspects.
Totally. The collaboration involves the Ngai Tahu Research Center, Sir Peter Jackson, bringing in traditional ecological knowledge, Maturanga Maori,
which sparks those vital debates. Supporters see cultural restoration, maybe ecosystem benefits.
While skeptics worry about ecological risks. And shouldn't resources go to species endangered now?
Right. But the key here seems to be Takanga customary Maori practices and ethics guiding the research, ensuring cultural sensitivity.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Does de-extinction change our conservation responsibilities?
Deep question.
On a more everyday level, travel news. The TSA made a change on the 8th.
End of the shoes-off policy at U.S. airports, effective immediately.
Yep. Citing better screening tech. And they hinted at other things like liquid limits might be reviewed too. Could make flying a bit easier.
That'd be welcome. On the public health side, though, less welcome news. Measles.
Yeah, a significant outbreak reported on July 8th. Several states, mainly hitting communities with low vaccination rates.
So the CDC is responding, and it brings back all those debates about vaccine mandates, misinformation.
Ongoing challenges there.
Definitely.
And globally, some big cultural and social events too. The World Fair US opened in Chicago.
July 7th, 8th. Over 80 countries, 3 weeks of culture, innovation, trying to foster global connections.
And in sports, a major upset.
Yeah, the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup. Saudi Pro League's Al Hilal beat Manchester City.
4-3 in extra time. Wow.
Huge shock. Sparked lots of talk about scheduling pressures, the tournament format.
Yeah.
Big implications for global club football.
And sadly, July 8th also brought news of some really awful tragedies.
The fireworks factory explosion in India. 10 killed.
A stark reminder about safety regulations, especially in informal sectors.
And those witchcraft killings in Bihar, India. 5 family members. Just highlights these deeply rooted, dangerous beliefs.
And the lead poisoning in China. Over 230 kids hospitalized from contaminated school meals.
Just awful. Raises serious questions about food safety, oversight.
So you look back at just one day, July 8th, 2025. It was a whirlwind, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Global, domestic, trade tensions, climate disasters, geopolitical moves, science breakthroughs.
It really hammers home how interconnected it all is. These things don't happen in isolation.
Not at all. And understanding a single day like this across all these different areas, it gives you a much richer, more nuanced picture.
You start to see the threads, right? The economy to climate, geopolitics to domestic policy.
Exactly. It gives you a real sense of the forces shaping our collective future.
Here, we hope this helps you, the listener, kind of process it all. Maybe reflect on how these events might shape your own understanding in the months and years ahead.
Yeah. And as you reflect, maybe consider this final thought. Given this rapid pace of change we're seeing and how interconnected everything is, what new forms of leadership, what new kinds of international cooperation might we actually need to navigate a future that looks this complex?